The water ran red where her knees pressed into the riverbank, and she could not tell any more whether the blood came from the gash across her palm or the older wound along her ribs that had reopened some time during the night. The stones beneath her were slick with moss and cold enough to ache through her threadbare trousers, and the current tugged at her fingers like something alive, something hungry. She had come to the river to wash the Alpha King's fish traps. That was her job. Not a servant, exactly. Not a slave by name. But something worse in practice because no one had given it a title, and things without titles could be treated however people saw fit. Ilara Voss, 23 years old, the pack's fish keeper. That was the term they used, though it meant something closer to the girl who stands in freezing water before dawn. So the rest of Thornmere Pack can eat smoked trout at breakfast without thinking about where it came from. She maintained the weirs. She cleaned the traps. She gutted and scaled and salted the catch in a stone shed behind the kitchens that smelled permanently of brine and iron, a smell that had seeped so deeply into her skin that even lye soap could not pull it out. Her hands were always cracked. Her nails were always short and ragged. The cold had put a permanent blue tinge under her fingernails that the pack healer once said looked like the early stages of something bad, but never followed up on, because Ilara was not the kind of person you followed up on. The gash on her palm was fresh. She had sliced it open on a broken trap hinge an hour ago, and the blood was still coming in slow, stubborn pulses that turned the water around her wrist into pale pink ribbons. She watched them unspool downstream, curling around rocks and dissolving into the current, and thought about how the river did not care whose blood it carried. It just carried it. The older wound was different. That one ran along her left side, 4 inches of raised scar tissue that Ronan, the pack beta, had given her 6 weeks ago when she had been too slow bringing firewood to the great hall. He had not even shifted, just backhanded her into the edge of a stone table hard enough to split the skin over her ribs. The bruise beneath had gone from purple to green to yellow, but the cut itself kept reopening because she could not stop working long enough to let it heal. And every time she bent to haul a net or lifted a crate of fish above her waist, she felt the edges pull apart like a mouth trying to speak. She pressed her bleeding palm flat against the moss and leaned forward to check the nearest trap. Empty. The second one held a single trout, half dead, its eye already filming over with that milky resignation fish get when they have stopped fighting. She freed it with her good hand and dropped it into the woven basket at her side, where it gave one weak flap and went still. Third trap empty. Fourth trap. Something had torn a hole in the mesh large enough to put a fist through. She would need to repair it, which meant asking the smith for wire, which meant standing outside his forge while he decided whether to acknowledge her or not. Last time, he had made her wait 40 minutes before telling her he was out of wire and she should come back tomorrow. And when she came back tomorrow, he had looked at her as if he had never seen her in his life. She was thinking about the wire, about the smith's blank, practiced indifference, when she heard footsteps on the path above the riverbank. Not casual footsteps. These were deliberate, measured, and there were too many of them. She looked up, water dripping from her forearms, and saw Maren, the Alpha's daughter, standing at the top of the slope with 2 of her friends, flanking her like bookends. Maren was beautiful in the way that a well-maintained knife is beautiful. Blonde hair pulled back tight enough to sharpen her cheekbones, eyes the color of wet slate. She wore riding leather and smelled like the cedar oil she used on her saddle, a smell that Alara associated with trouble the way most people associate smoke with fire. Maren did not come down to the river. She looked down from above, which was the point. Well, well. The little fish girl is bleeding again. She said it to her friends, not to Alara. As if Alara were a weather condition being observed. Look at that. The water is turning pink. One of the friends, a narrow-faced girl named Sable, made a noise of disgust. That is revolt. The Alpha will have her whipped if she contaminates the water supply. It is a river, Sable, Maren said, with a patience that suggested she found her friend genuinely stupid. It flows. That is the entire point of a river. Alara said nothing. She had learned years ago that speaking to Maren was like feeding a fire. Any words at all, became fuel. Silence was not exactly a shield, but it was the closest thing she had. Maren studied her for a long moment. Then she tilted her head in that way she had, the way that meant she was about to say something that would land exactly where it would hurt most. My father is expecting a delegation today. The Alpha King of Ashenmoor and his retinue. She let the name land. You know what that means. Alara knew what it meant. Everyone in Thornmere knew. Kyle Ashenmoor, the king who ruled 7 packs. The man whose wolf was rumored to be so large it blocked out the sun when he shifted, which was obviously exaggeration, but the kind of exaggeration that told you something true about how people felt about him. He was coming to discuss territory borders, or water rights, or some other political thing that Alara would never be privy to, because fish keepers did not attend diplomatic dinners. It means, Maren continued, that the kitchens need triple the catch by noon. And you have. She glanced at the basket. 1 half-dead trout. Charming. The traps are empty, Alara said, breaking her own rule about silence, because the alternative was being blamed for something she could not control. The river has been low for weeks. The spawning run is late. Maren smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who has found exactly the opening she was looking for. Then I suppose you had better figure something out. Because if the Alpha King of Ashenmoor sits down to dinner tonight, and there is no fish on the table, my father will know exactly whose failure that is. And you know what he does with failures. She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Her boots crunching on the gravel path, her friends followed. Sable looked back once, and in that backward glance there was something unexpected. Not pity exactly. Something more like recognition. A flicker that said, I know this is wrong. I know this is unfair. And then it was gone. And she was gone. And Alara was alone with the river, and the blood, and the single dying trout. Alara sat back on her heels and let the cold seep up through her knees. Her palm throbbed. Her side ached. The sky above the canyon walls was the color of old pewter, and somewhere in the distance a crow was calling in that flat mechanical way that sounded less like bird song and more like a hinge that needed oil. She looked down at her bleeding hand, at the way the blood dripped steadily from the heel of her palm into the current. The river took it greedily, pulling the red threads downstream, around the bend, out of sight. She wondered, in the distant, dissociated way that exhaustion makes possible, where her blood would end up. How far downstream it would travel before diluting into nothing. Whether any of the fish below would taste it and think it was just another part of the river's endless mineral vocabulary. She did not know that 3 miles downstream, The river passed through the eastern edge of Ashenmoor territory. She did not know that a man was standing on that bank at that exact moment, filling his canteen, and that the water he raised to his lips carried, in concentrations too small for any human tongue to detect, but not too small for a wolf's, the faintest trace of something that would change both their lives completely. She did not know any of that. She just knew the traps were empty, and she had until noon. Elara pulled herself up and waded deeper. The water hit her waist like a wall of cold, and for a moment her vision went white at the edges. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. A heel of bread and a scraping of rendered fat that she had found in the kitchen discard pile, wrapped in a cloth that smelled like onion skins. It had not been enough then. It was catastrophically not enough now, as she fought the current to reach the deeper pools where the trout sometimes sheltered during low water. This was the part of the river where the canyon narrowed and the walls rose high on either side, turning the water dark green and channeling the current into something muscular and focused. The rocks here were covered in a slick algae that made every step a negotiation with gravity, and Elara moved with the careful, practiced economy of someone who had fallen enough times to know exactly how much a fall costs. She reached the first deep pool and crouched, pressing her wounded hand against her thigh to keep the blood out of the water. There, a flash of silver in the green depths. She could see them down there, 4, maybe 5 trout, holding position against the current with that effortless, arrogant stillness that fish have. She would need to guide them toward the shallows, toward the backup net she kept staked between 2 rocks for exactly this situation. It took her 40 minutes. 40 minutes of wading, of positioning, of moving so slowly that her muscles locked and her teeth chattered, and the wound on her side opened fully and began to bleed in earnest, soaking the left side of her shirt with a warmth that was the only warm thing about her. By the end, she had 7 trout in the net, and a headache that pulsed behind her eyes like a second heartbeat. She carried them back to the stone shed in a basket that dug grooves into her shoulder, leaving a trail of river water and diluted blood on the path behind her. The shed was cold and dim, and smelled exactly the way it always smelled, of salt and fish guts and the particular metallic sweetness of a whetstone that has been used to sharpen the same knife 10,000 times. She laid the fish out on the stone slab and began to work. Scale, gut, salt, repeat. The knife was good. The knife was the one good thing in her life that she could point to without qualification. She had sharpened it herself, honed the edge to a whisper, and it moved through the trout's belly with a sound like silk being cut. She worked by feel as much as by sight, her fingers knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly where the bones were, exactly how to separate the flesh from the spine in one clean motion. Her hands were ruined, cracked and scarred and perpetually cold, but they were precise. They knew this work the way a musician's hands know an instrument, and in the rhythm of it, she found something that was not quite peace, but was at least the absence of active suffering. She was halfway through the 4th fish when the door opened. The light that came in was wrong. Too bright. Too warm. As if someone had opened a door not into the kitchen courtyard she knew was out there, but into some other place entirely. She squinted against it, knife still in her hand, and saw a silhouette that filled the doorframe in a way that made the doorframe seem poorly designed. It was enormous. That was the first thing. Not just tall, though he was that. broad in a way that suggested his body had been built for a purpose more violent than walking through doors. His shoulders blocked the light so completely that the shed went dim again, and in that dimness she could make out the details. Dark hair, cut short at the sides and longer on top, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the canyon walls, a scar that ran from his left temple down past his ear and disappeared into the collar of his shirt. His eyes were the color of dark amber, almost bronze, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. He stood there for 3 full seconds, which does not sound like a long time unless you are standing in a fish shed with blood on your hands, and a stranger the size of a wall is staring at you, as if you have just done something impossible. Then he inhaled. It was not a casual breath. It was deliberate, deep, the kind of inhalation that pulls air across the back of the throat and into the sinuses where the wolf lives. His eyes changed. Not the color, but the depth. Something moved behind them. Something vast and patient and terrifyingly focused, like watching a predator surface from deep water. Elara took a step back. Her hip hit the edge of the stone slab. The knife trembled in her hand, not because she was considering using it, but because her body had started shaking and she could not make it stop. The man in the doorway spoke, and his voice was lower than she expected, rougher, as if the words were being dragged up from somewhere deep in his chest against their will. "You are bleeding." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with a weight that turned it into something else entirely. An accusation, maybe, or a confession. As if her bleeding were something he had been expecting, something he had been waiting for, something that confirmed a suspicion he had carried for years without knowing what it was. Elara started, and then stopped, because her wolf, the wolf she had been told she did not have, the wolf that had never once stirred in 23 years of full moons and shifting ceremonies and the quiet, persistent shame of being the only member of Thornmere Pack who could not shift. Her wolf moved. It moved the way a creature moves when it wakes from a very long sleep. Slowly at first, then with a sudden, violent urgency that knocked the breath out of her lungs and sent a wave of heat rolling through her body from the base of her spine to the top of her skull. Her vision sharpened. The dim shed became bright with detail she had never noticed before. The grain of the wood, the individual crystals in the salt, the way the man's pulse was visible in his throat, steady and strong, and beating at a frequency that exactly matched, the rhythm of her own. His scent hit her like a door slamming open. Cedar smoke and winter rain, and something beneath both of those that she had no word for, something ancient and male and claiming. It filled the shed. It filled her chest. It filled the spaces between her ribs where the cold had lived for years, and suddenly, violently, did not. "Mate." The word was not spoken aloud. It came from inside her, from the wolf that should not exist, and it resonated through her bones with a certainty that left no room for doubt or qualification, or the careful, defensive skepticism that had kept her alive in Thornmere for 23 years. The man took one step into the shed. The floorboards groaned under his weight. His eyes had not left hers, and in them she could see the same impossible recognition, the same tectonic shift from stranger to everything that was happening in her own body, happening in his. "Who did this to you?" Again, not a question. He was looking at her side, at the blood soaking through her shirt, and his jaw was doing something that she would later learn meant his wolf was very, very close to the surface. And the only thing keeping it there was a lifetime of discipline and a very specific understanding of what would happen to anyone in this room who was not her if he let it out. She opened her mouth to answer, to say it was nothing, an accident, a fall. The lie she had told so many times it had become reflex, automatic, the conversational equivalent of flinching. But the wolf inside her, this new, impossible, blazingly alive presence that had apparently been waiting 23 years for this exact moment to announce itself, would not let her lie. Not to this man. Not to her mate. "The beta," she said. And it came out so quiet, so matter-of-fact, so stripped of self-pity, that it was worse than crying. It was the voice of someone who has been hurt so many times that describing it has become as routine as describing the weather. Something happened to his face. It did not change expression exactly. The bones were still in the same places, the scar was still there, the jaw was still set. But something behind all of it shifted, like watching tectonic plates move, and the temperature in the shed dropped or maybe rose. She could not tell because her body was doing things she did not understand. And the only thing she knew for certain was that the man standing in front of her was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen, and also somehow, impossibly, the safest. He looked at the blood on her hand. He looked at the blood on her side. He looked at the knife she was still holding, which was the wrong thing to be holding when a wolf this powerful was in this state, and she should have dropped it, but she did not, because her hands knew work, and work was the only language they spoke. He raised his eyes back to hers. "You are coming with me," he said. "I have to finish the fish," she said. And even as the words came out, she understood how insane they sounded, how completely mismatched to the magnitude of what was happening. But the fish were real, and the dinner was real, and Alpha Harron's punishment for failure was real. And the man in the doorway was impossible. And impossible things do not outweigh real things when you have spent your entire life being crushed by real things. Something in his expression cracked. Not anger, not frustration. Something else. Something that looked like pain, as if her words had told him more about her life than any explanation could have. He crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 strides, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his body, a furnace heat, a wolf's fever-bright warmth that pushed back the cold in the shed like a tide. He did not touch her. He stood close enough to touch, but did not. And the restraint in that, the visible effort of it, told her more about his character than 1,000 grand gestures could have. "What is your name?" Elara Voss." He repeated it, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it had ever sounded before. It sounded like something worth saying. "Elara Voss. I am Kael Ashenmore," she knew. Of course she knew. The Alpha King. The ruler of 7 packs. The man whose name alone was enough to make seasoned warriors lower their eyes. He was standing in her fish shed, smelling like cedar smoke, looking at her as if she had just pulled the ground out from under his feet, and he did not mind falling. "I know who you are," she said. "Then you know that I am not asking." For a long moment, the only sound was the river outside and the slow drip of blood from her hand onto the stone floor. She could feel the mate bond between them like a wire pulled taut, vibrating at a frequency that made her teeth ache and her chest expand, and every survival instinct she had scream 2 contradictory things at once. Run. Stay. She put the knife down. It was not surrender. It was not submission. It was a calculated assessment by a woman who had spent 23 years calculating, who understood risk and cost and the precise mathematics of survival in a world that had never once balanced its equations in her favor. The knife went down, and she looked up at him, and she said the first honest thing she had said to anyone in years. "I cannot go with you. They will not let me." His expression did not change, but his eyes did something that she would later learn to recognize as the look he got right before he dismantled something completely. "They," he said, with a quiet emphasis that turned the word into a threat, "do not get a say." Footsteps outside. Voices. The clatter of the kitchen door opening and closing. Elara's stomach clenched with a fear so practiced it was almost comfortable, the way old shoes are comfortable, shaped by years of use into something that fits perfectly, even though it hurts. The door to the fish shed opened again, and Ronan walked in. I was mid-sentence, already talking, the way he always was when he entered a room. Because Ronan experienced other people not as presences to be acknowledged, but as audiences to be addressed. The words were something about the dinner preparation, about quantities, about deadlines, and they died in his throat when he saw who was standing next to Elara. Ronan was not small. He was the beta of Thornmere, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, a man who had built his authority on physical presence and the willingness to use it. But standing in the same room as Kyle Ashenmore, he looked like a rough draft, a preliminary sketch, something drawn by a student before the master arrives to show how it is actually done. Alpha King. Ronan recovered quickly, which was one of his skills. He was good at surfaces. He could rearrange his face into respect faster than most people could blink. "We were not expecting you until this evening. Let me escort you to the Great Hall, Alpha Harren." Kyle did not look at him. He was still looking at Elara, and the quality of his attention, its completeness, its absolute refusal to be redirected, made Ronan's words evaporate like water on a hot stone. "This woman," Kale said, still not looking at Ronan, still looking at Elara, "is bleeding." Ronan glanced at her. She saw his eyes register the blood on her shirt, the blood on her hand, and she saw the calculation happen, the quick assessment of how much trouble this could be, weighed against the relative insignificance of the person bleeding. "The fish keeper," Ronan said. "She cut herself on the traps. It happens. She is careless." Kale turned his head. The movement was slow, controlled, the kind of slow that wolves use when they want you to understand that speed is available to them at any moment, and they are choosing, specifically and deliberately, not to use it yet. He looked at Ronan, and Ronan, to his credit, held the gaze for almost 3 full seconds before something in his posture changed. It was subtle. A slight rounding of the shoulders, a millimeter of retreat in the feet. The body's honest response to a threat that the mind was still trying to rationalize away. "She told me," Kyle said, and each word was placed with the precision of someone laying stones, that the beta gave her that wound. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of the sound of Ronan's breathing going shallow, full of the sound of the river outside continuing its indifferent business, full of the sound of Elara's heartbeat, which she realized with a strange, dissociated clarity was hammering not with fear, but with something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. Hope. Raw, terrified, completely irrational hope. Ronan laughed. It was the wrong thing to do, and he knew it was the wrong thing to do even as he did it. But panic makes people reach for familiar tools, and laughter was how Ronan had always deflected things he did not want to deal with. She is an Omega, Alpha King. Barely even pack. And she lies. She lies constantly. Ask anyone. I am not asking anyone, Kael said. I am telling you what she told me. And I am watching your face, and your face is telling me she did not lie. Ronan's laughter dried up. In its place was something Alara had never seen on his face before, something she would not have believed possible if she had not been standing close enough to see the individual pores of his skin and the way the blood drained out of them one by one. I was afraid. The beta of Thornmere Pack, the man who had hit her and starved her and stood over her with his fists clenched while she curled on the floor of the great hall, trying to protect her ribs, was afraid. And then Kael said something that rearranged Alara's understanding of power and what it was for. You will wait in the courtyard. You will not leave. You will not speak to anyone. When I am finished here, you and I will have a conversation about what happens to men who leave marks on women who belong to me. Belong to, Ronan started. Kael's wolf surfaced. Not a shift, not a full transformation, but a ripple. A seismic tremor that traveled across his skin and darkened his eyes from amber to black and filled the room with a pressure that made the air feel thick and close, like the moment before lightning strikes. The fish on the stone slab slid half an inch from the vibration. The salt crystals rattled in their box. Ronan left. He did not walk. He did not retreat with dignity. He backed away, turned, and moved through the door with the graceless urgency of a man who has just understood something fundamental about his position in the food chain and does not like what he has learned. The door swung shut behind him. The pressure eased. Kael's eyes faded back to amber, and he let out a breath that seemed to cost him something, as if the restraint of not following Ronan and finishing the conversation physically had required the same energy as lifting something very heavy. He turned back to Alara. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Her, with blood on her hands and fish scales in her hair, and 23 years of careful, disciplined endurance written across her face like a map of a country that has been at war for too long. Him, with his scar and his impossible size and his eyes that were somehow both the most threatening and the most gentle things she had ever seen. You do not belong to me, he said, and the words contradicted everything he had just said to Ronan. And the contradiction was the most honest thing she had heard in years. You do not belong to anyone, but my wolf has chosen you. And I have learned that my wolf has better judgment than I do. She did not know what to say to that. She had spent so long preparing for cruelty that kindness caught her completely off guard, the way a sudden silence can be more startling than a loud noise. He looked at her hand, still bleeding. He held out his own, palm up, the way you offer a hand to a frightened animal, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. Let me see, he said, and because she was tired, because she was bleeding, because the wolf inside her was pressing against her chest with a warmth that felt like the first morning of spring after the longest winter, she placed her bloody hand in his. His fingers closed around hers and the world rearranged itself. It was not dramatic. There was no explosion of light, no surge of music, no cinematic swell of emotion. It was quieter than that, more fundamental, like the moment when a bone that has been broken for years finally sets correctly, and you realize that you have been carrying the pain for so long that you stopped noticing it. And now that it is gone, the absence is louder than the pain ever was. I examined the cut on her palm with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that size. His thumb traced the edge of the wound, not pressing, just following the line of it. And she felt the touch travel up her arm and across her shoulders and down her spine and into the place where the wolf was curled, waiting, awake for the first time. Thought, "This needs stitching," he said. "I have gut thread in the box by the door," she said, because she was the kind of person who kept suture materials next to her fish supplies, because no one else was going to stitch her up, and she had learned to do it herself. He looked at her then with an expression she could not read. Or rather, she could read it. She just did not believe what it said. Because what it said was, "This is the bravest person I have ever met, and I want to burn the world that made her this way." I did not say that. He said, "Show me." She showed him. She got the gut thread and the curved needle from the battered tin box by the door, and she sat on the stone bench beside the slab, and she held out her palm, and he sat beside her and stitched the wound shut with hands that were steady and sure and surprisingly skilled, and she did not cry because she had not cried in years, but she pressed her lips together hard enough that the skin around them went white, and he noticed, and he did not say anything about it. And the not saying anything was its own kind of tenderness. When he finished, he tied off the thread and set the needle down and held her hand for a moment longer than necessary, examining his work. His thumb rested against her wrist, against the pulse point, and she knew he could feel her heartbeat. And she knew he knew what it meant that her heartbeat was as fast as a sparrow's. And she did not care. Then the door opened again, and this time it was Alpha Harren. Harren was not an impressive man. That was the first thing most people noticed about him, and the thing that explained almost everything else. He was average height, average build, with features that were pleasant in the way that beige is pleasant. Nothing wrong with them. Nothing memorable about them. He had been Alpha of Thornmere for 18 years, not because he was the strongest or the smartest or the most visionary, but because he was the most political, the most patient, the most willing to make the small, daily compromises that keep a medium-sized pack running without ever truly thriving. He stood in the doorway and took in the scene. The Alpha King of Ashenmoor, sitting on a stone bench in a fish shed, holding the hand of the pack's Omega fish keeper, with blood on both of them and the smell of mate bond so thick in the air that a wolf with no nose could have detected it. To his credit, Harren's face gave away nothing. 18 years of politics had given him that much. "Alpha King," he said smoothly. "Welcome to Thornmere. I apologize that your first experience of our hospitality is—" He gestured vaguely at the shed. "This." Cale released Alara's hand and stood. The difference between the two Alphas was not subtle. It was the difference between a candle and a bonfire, and Harren knew it, and Cale knew Harren knew it, and Alara knew all of this, because she had spent her life reading power dynamics the way sailors read weather, because misreading either one could kill you. "Your hospitality," Cale said, "includes a beta who strikes women and a pack that starves its weakest member. I would say the fish shed is the most honest room in your territory." Harren's composure flickered, just for a moment, a tightening around the eyes that said, "This is not how this meeting was supposed to go." "The Omega exaggerates," Harren said carefully. "She is not significant. She has no wolf. She contributes minimally. I understand that as a guest you may have certain concerns, but pack discipline is an internal matter." Cale smiled. It was the least reassuring smile Alara had ever seen. It was the smile of someone who has just been given exactly the justification he needs to do something he was going to do anyway. "She is my mate," he said, "and that makes her significant." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that exists in the gap between the lightning and the thunder, when you know the sound is coming and the only question is how loud it will be. Harren stared at Elara. She had never seen him look directly at her before. In 18 years, she had been invisible to him, a fixture, a function, something that existed in the periphery of his awareness, the way plumbing exists, noticed only when it stops working. Now he was looking at her, really looking, and she could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the political implications, the strategic ramifications, the absolute vertigo-inducing inconvenience of having the most powerful wolf on the continent. Claim a mate, bond with the most powerless member of his pack. "That is unexpected," Harren said, and beneath the diplomat's composure, beneath the measured tone and the neutral expression, Elara heard something she had never heard from Alpha Harren before. Uncertainty. Real, genuine, foundationless uncertainty. The kind that comes when the ground you have built your life on turns out to be thinner than you thought. "I would like to discuss this in private," Harren continued. "Perhaps in the Great Hall, where we can discuss it here," Cale said. "Where my mate is comfortable, your mate." Harren said it as if testing the word for structural integrity. "Alpha King, with respect. She is an omega without a wolf. She cannot even shift. The bond must be—" He stopped. He stopped because Kael's expression had changed in a way that suggested the next word out of Harren's mouth would determine whether Thornmere Pack continued to exist. "The bond must be what?" Kael said softly. Harren was a politician. He was not a brave man. He was not a visionary. But he was a survivor. And survivors know when they are standing on the edge of a cliff, and he chose, wisely, to step back from it. "The bond must be honored," Harren said. "Of course, she is yours to claim." Elara watched this exchange from the stone bench, with blood drying on her shirt, and her newly stitched palm cradled against her chest, and she felt something that she would spend weeks trying to name. Not gratitude exactly, not relief. Something more complicated. Something like watching the bars of a cage dissolve one by one, and realizing that you had spent so long adapting to captivity that freedom looked less like a door opening and more like a floor disappearing, and you were not sure yet whether you would fly or fall. "She is not mine to claim," Kael said, turning to look at her. "She is hers. I am simply asking if she will allow me to stand beside her." I was asking. The Alpha King of Ashenmoor, the man who could level this pack with a thought, was asking, was standing in a fish shed that smelled like brine and guts and old salt, surrounded by trout carcasses and broken trap wire, asking a bleeding omega with fish scales in her hair if she would let him love her. And Harren, standing in the doorway, had a moment that Elara would remember for the rest of her life. Not because of what he said, but because of what his face did. For just an instant, less than a second, before the politician's mask slid back into place, Harren's expression crumbled into something that looked almost like shame, as if watching Kael ask had shown him something about himself, about the casual cruelty of 18 years of indifference that he had not wanted to see. It passed. The mask returned. But it had been there, and Elara had seen it, and it was the closest thing to an apology she would ever get from him. "I need to think," Elara said. Kael nodded, as if this were the most reasonable thing in the world, as if he had not just upended 2 decades of political relationships and threatened the sovereignty of a neighboring pack, and revealed a mate bond that would reshape the power dynamics of 7 territories. As if she had said something as simple and unchallengeable as "I need to breathe." "Take all the time you need," he said. "I will be in the Great Hall. Your beta will be with me." He said this last part to Harren, and the way he said it made it clear that "with me" did not mean as a companion, but rather as a guest of the kind who is not permitted to leave. Cale walked to the door. He paused, filling the frame again, the light cutting around him. He looked back. "Elara." She looked up. "The fish are irrelevant," he said. "If anyone in this pack goes hungry tonight, it will not be you." Then he was gone, and the shed was cold again, and she was alone with the trout and the blood and the needle and the thread and the wolf that was awake inside her for the first time, curled and warm and purring like a banked fire. Waiting. Elara sat in the fish shed for 17 minutes. She knew this because she counted the drips from the leaking gutter pipe that ran along the eave outside the door. Each drip took about 3 seconds. She counted 340 of them, which meant roughly 17 minutes of sitting on a stone bench in a room that smelled like dead fish, pressing her stitched palm against her knee and trying to understand what had just happened. The wolf inside her had not gone back to sleep. It was there, present in a way that nothing had ever been present inside her before, like a second heartbeat, like a furnace someone had lit in a room she had always believed was empty. It was not demanding, it was patient, but its patience had the quality of something that has waited a very long time and is now certain that the waiting is almost over. She looked at the remaining fish on the slab. 4 trout, gutted and salted. Not enough for a diplomatic dinner. Not enough for anything. She picked up the knife, finished the work, wrapped the fish in cheesecloth, and carried them to the kitchen. The kitchen was chaos. She could hear it before she saw it. Pots banging, voices shouting, the clatter of plates, and the hiss of fat in cast iron. The smell hit her in the corridor, roasting meat and burned sugar, and the sharp green of fresh herbs. She pushed through the door with the basket on her hip and walked into the controlled mayhem of a kitchen, preparing for the most important dinner Thornmere had hosted in a decade. No one looked at her. This was normal. In the kitchen, Elara was a delivery mechanism, a pair of hands that appeared with fish and disappeared without comment. She set the basket on the prep table and turned to leave. Wait. The head cook, a woman named Bridget with forearms like ham hocks and a permanent expression of exhausted competence, was looking at the basket. "That is 7 fish," Bridget said. "Yes, I asked for 20. The river is low. The spawning run is." Bridget held up a hand. "I do not care about the river. I care about feeding 43 people tonight, including the Alpha King of Ashenmoor, who I am told eats like a siege engine." 7 fish. She said it the way a doctor says terminal. As a fact, that is also a verdict. "I can go back," Elara started. Bridget looked at her. Really looked. Saw the blood, the bandaged hand, the way she was favoring her left side. Bridget was not kind, exactly. Kindness was a luxury the head cook of a middling pack could not afford. But she was practical, and practicality sometimes resembled kindness in the same way that a splint resembles a hug. Both are designed to hold something broken together. "Go sit down," Bridget said. "You look like something the river washed up. I will figure out the fish situation. We will do trout mousse. I can stretch 7 fish into 40 portions if I use enough cream, and nobody asks questions." Elara sat down on a stool in the corner of the kitchen and watched Bridget work. And for a moment, in the warmth of the kitchen and the noise of the preparation and the smell of bread baking. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not much, just enough to breathe a little deeper. Just enough to let the wolf inside her settle into a posture that was less vigilance and more rest. Then the kitchen door slammed open, and Maren walked in. She was dressed for dinner. Silver silk that caught the kitchen firelight and threw it back in warm, metallic flashes. Her hair was down now, and it fell around her shoulders like a campaign. She looked exactly like what she was, the daughter of an alpha, the presumptive Luna of whatever pack she chose to grace with her presence. A woman who had never in her life stood in freezing water before dawn to clean fish traps. She walked straight to Elara. "Is it true?" Maren said. Elara did not pretend to misunderstand. "Is what true?" "The Alpha King." Maren's voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. Behind the silver composure, something was happening, and Elara could not tell if it was rage or jealousy or fear or some alchemical combination of all three. "He claims you are his mate." Elara said nothing. Not because she was choosing silence as a strategy this time, but because she genuinely did not know what to say. The truth felt impossible. A lie felt dangerous. So she sat on her stool in the corner of the kitchen and said nothing and waited. Maren leaned in close enough that Elara could smell her cedar oil, and beneath it, something sharper. The metallic smell of adrenaline, of a wolf whose composure was costing her something. "You have no wolf," Maren said. "Everyone knows it. You have never shifted. You have never felt a bond. You cannot even sense the pack link. And you expect me to believe that the most powerful alpha on the continent walked into your fish shed and felt a mate bond with you." "I do not expect you to believe anything," Elara said. "I do not even know if I believe it." Something shifted in Maren's expression. The anger was still there, but underneath it, just for a moment, Elara saw something she recognized because she had felt it herself, 1,000 times, in 1,000 small moments of confusion and unfairness. Bewilderment. The simple, naked bewilderment of someone whose understanding of how the world works has just been contradicted by the world itself. It lasted 2 seconds. Then Maren straightened, and the silver composure returned, and she turned on her heel and walked out of the kitchen without another word, and Elara sat on her stool and pressed her bandaged hand against her knee and listened to her wolf's steady, patient pulse, and thought about how strange it was that the most significant day of her life had started with a broken trap hinge and a dead trout. Dinner was at 8. Elara was not invited. She had never been invited to a meal in the Great Hall. She ate her meals in the fish shed or the kitchen corridor, or sometimes, when the weather was warm enough, on the bank of the river with her feet in the water, which was the closest thing she had to a dining room. Tonight she ate bread and cheese in the corridor outside the kitchen, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, listening to the sounds of the dinner through the closed door. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the deep bass rumble of a voice she now recognized instantly, the way you recognize a song you have heard only once, but that lodged itself in your memory with the force of revelation. She was halfway through the cheese when the door opened, and a woman she had never seen before stepped into the corridor. The woman was tall, dark-skinned, with close-cropped silver hair, and the build of someone who ran long distances for reasons unrelated to fitness. She wore traveling leathers that had the soft, broken-in look of constant use, and her eyes were sharp and green and assessing in a way that made Elara think of the hawks that circled above the canyon. "You are Elara, the woman said. Not a question. Yes, I am Sarah, commander of the Ashen Moor Guard. My Alpha sent me to find you. Elara set down the bread. The wolf inside her perked up at the mention of his name, even indirect, even through the intermediary of a stranger. And she felt the pull of the bond like a current in the river, steady and insistent and flowing in only one direction. I wants me to come to dinner, Elara said. Sarah looked at her, at the bread in her hand, at the floor she was sitting on, at the blood still visible through the bandage on her palm. I wants to make sure you have eaten, Sarah said. He was specific about that. I am eating, Elara said, and held up the bread as evidence. Sarah's mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She crouched down, bringing herself to Elara's level, and her voice when she spoke again was different, softer, with a grain of something that sounded almost like experience. When my Alpha decides someone matters, they matter completely. There is no middle ground with him, no halfway. I have served him for 11 years, and I have never seen his wolf react to anyone the way it reacted to you today. He came into the great hall, smelling like fish blood and cedar, and he sat down at your Alpha's table and told the entire room that he had found his mate and that anyone who had ever mistreated her should start making peace with their gods. She paused. I did not name anyone specifically, she continued. But your beta has not stopped sweating since he sat down, and your Alpha's daughter has been staring at her plate for 40 minutes. So I think the message was received. Elara looked at the bread, at the floor, at the corridor she had eaten 1,000 meals in, alone, always alone. What happens now? She said. Sarah stood up. Now, she said, you decide. He will not force you. He will not demand. But if you choose to come with us to Ashen Moor, I can tell you this. You will never sit on a corridor floor again. Elara looked up at this woman, this commander, this person who served the most powerful wolf on the continent and who had crouched on a cold stone floor to speak to a fish keeper as if she were a person whose answers mattered. I need to close the traps first, Elara said. Sarah nodded, as if this, too, were perfectly reasonable. As if a woman being offered a throne was allowed to say, wait, I need to tend the river first, and the offer would still be there when she got back. I will tell him, Sarah said. She left. Elara finished the bread. Then she got up, walked out of the keep, and went down to the river in the dark. The moon was 3/4 full, and the water was silver with it. The traps were dark shapes in the current, and the sound of the river was the sound it always was. Steady, impersonal, enduring. She waded in up to her knees and began closing the traps one by one, folding the mesh, securing the hinges, staking them against the current. The water was cold enough to make her bones ache, but the cold felt different now. Less like punishment, more like something she was choosing to endure because the work mattered, not because someone had told her it was her only option. She was closing the last trap when she felt him, not heard, not saw, felt. The mate bond, humming to life like a wire touched by electricity, and she turned, and he was there on the bank, standing in the moonlight, and he looked like something out of a story that no one would believe if you told it. He had changed for dinner. Dark clothes, well cut, the kind of fabric that does not call attention to itself because it does not need to. His scar was silver in the moonlight. His eyes were amber going dark. Sarah said you were closing the traps, he said. Yes, she said you needed to do it before you could decide. Elara stood in the river, and looked at him, and felt the wolf inside her lean toward him, like a plant toward light, involuntary, instinctive, undeniable. "It is not about the traps," she said. "I know," he said. "It is about—" She stopped. The words were hard because they were true, and true words are always harder than lies, which is why people prefer lies, because lies are smooth and flexible and fit easily into the shapes we need them to fit. "If I go with you," she said, "and it is real, and I am your mate, then everything that happened to me here, all of it, was unnecessary. All the pain, all the cold, all the years. They did not have to happen, and I do not know how to live with that." I was quiet for a long time. The river ran between them, silver and black. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough and stripped of every pretense of the Alpha King, every layer of power and authority and command. He spoke to her as a man speaks to the person whose opinion is the only one that has ever frightened him. "I cannot undo what happened to you. I cannot make those years not exist. But I can tell you this. The pain was real. The cold was real. The years were real. And they made you the person who stands in a freezing river at midnight, closing fish traps, because the work matters even when no one else thinks it does. That person is the person my wolf chose. Not despite those years. Because of them." She stood in the water and let his words settle into the spaces the cold had carved. Then something happened that neither of them expected. Her wolf shifted, not fully. Not the explosive total transformation that born wolves experience. Something different, something slower and stranger. It started in her hands, a tingling that traveled up her arms and across her shoulders, and her vision changed, sharpening, deepening, the moonlight becoming brighter and richer and more textured, and she could smell everything: the moss on the rocks, the iron in the water, the cedar and rain and ancient, claiming scent of the man on the bank, and beneath all of it, something else, something deep, something old, a scent like starlight and frozen earth and the very first winter. Her eyes, they were glowing, not amber like his, silver, a bright, clean, impossible silver that lit up the dark surface of the river and cast her reflection back at her in a face she almost did not recognize because it was hers, but also more, as if everything she had ever been had been compressed into a seed, and the seed was finally, after 23 years, beginning to open. Cale made a sound, not a word, a sound from somewhere deeper than language, from the place where the wolf lives. He stepped to the edge of the bank, and his eyes were wide, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure was gone. Not anger, not aggression. Awe. "Your wolf," he said. "Elara, your wolf is—" She looked down at her hands. They were shimmering. The silver light was coming from her skin. From under it, as if her blood itself had caught fire, with a light that had no heat but infinite warmth. "A lunar wolf," he whispered. She did not know what that meant. She would learn later. She would learn that lunar wolves were born once in a generation, maybe less. That their bloodline carried the old magic, the magic that predated the packs and the territories and the hierarchies, the magic that came from the moon itself, that they could heal rivers, that they could wake the dead fish in dying streams, that their blood, shed into water, could restore what pollution and neglect and greed had destroyed. She would learn that the river of Ashenmoor Kael's river, the river that gave his territory life, had been dying for 3 years, poisoned by a rival pack's upstream mining. The fish were gone. The water was turning grey. His people were beginning to starve, and no healer, no witch, no medicine had been able to stop it. She would learn that this morning, 3 miles downstream, from where she knelt bleeding into the current. His scouts had reported something impossible. The fish were back. A small cluster, just a handful, circling in a pool of water that had gone from grey to clear in a matter of hours. As if something upstream had fed the river. As if something had bled into it, and the bleeding had been a kind of gift. She would learn all of this. But right now, standing in the moonlit river, with silver light pouring from her skin, and a wolf she had never known. She had howling silently inside her chest. All she knew was this. She was not what they had told her she was. She had never been what they told her she was. Kael reached out his hand. The same gesture as before. Palm up, open, offering. But this time, there was something different in his face. Something that went beyond the mate bond and the attraction and the possessiveness. Something that looked like a man who has been searching for something so long that he had started to believe it did not exist, and now it is standing in front of him, glowing silver, and he is terrified that if he blinks, it will disappear. "Come out of the river," he said, and she did. She took his hand, and the silver light flared where their skin met, bright enough to cast shadows on the canyon walls, bright enough that the trout in the deep pool downstream felt it, and stirred and turned their faces toward the current, and Kael pulled her out of the water and onto the bank and held her against his chest, and she was soaking wet and freezing cold and shaking with something that was not cold at all, and his arms went around her, and the heat of him drove the river out of her bones, and she pressed her face into his chest and breathed in cedar smoke and winter rain and mate, and her wolf settled into a posture of total, absolute peace. They stood like that for a long time. Then she pulled back and looked up at him and said, "I will come with you." And he looked down at her and said nothing, because his wolf had taken over his face, and his wolf was not interested in words. His wolf was interested in the silver light in her eyes, and the heartbeat against his chest, and the absolute, bone-deep, tectonic certainty that this was it. This was the thing he had been built for. Not the throne, not the 7 packs, not the wars or the treaties or the alliances. This, her, here. He kissed her forehead. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a wolf's gesture, a press of the mouth to the skin that said mine and yours, and I will destroy anything that tries to separate us. Then they walked back to the keep together, her hand in his, silver light fading slowly from her skin, but not from her eyes. Not yet. And every wolf in Thornmere who happened to be near a window or a door stopped what they were doing and stared, because the fish-keeper was walking beside the Alpha King, and her eyes were glowing like twin moons, and the power coming off her was not the power of an Omega. It was not the power of a fish-keeper. It was the power of something old and sacred and forgotten, and it was awake. News travelled through Thornmere Pack, the way fire travels through dry grass. By midnight, wolf in the territory knew. The Omega has a wolf. The Omega is a lunar wolf. The Alpha King has claimed her as his mate. The reactions were predictable in their variety. Disbelief from the elders, who had tested Alara at every shifting ceremony for a decade and declared her wolfless. Fear from the wolves who had participated in her mistreatment, which was most of them, because cruelty is never the work of a single villain. It is an ecosystem, and every member of Thornmere who had walked past her without acknowledgement, who had eaten the fish she caught without knowing her name, who had heard Ronan's casual violence and said nothing, because saying nothing was easier, was now calculating the distance between their conscience and the Alpha King's reach. And there was wonder. A few, the youngest wolves, the ones who had not yet learned to look away from uncomfortable things, stood in doorways and watched Elara walk past with silver in her eyes, and felt something that they did not have the words for yet, but that they would remember for the rest of their lives. The specific, indelible image of a person becoming more than the world had allowed them to be. Cale installed Elara in the guest quarters of the keep, which was a stone-walled room with an actual bed and a fire and a window that looked out over the river. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the bed, which had clean sheets, and the fire, which was warm, and the window, which showed her the same river she had been standing in an hour ago, but from a perspective she had never seen. From above, from inside, from the position of someone who lives in a building with windows rather than a shed with a door that does not lock. "You do not have to decide anything tonight," Cale said from the doorway, because he would not enter the room uninvited, because the same man who had threatened a beta and stared down an alpha and declared his mate to an entire pack of strangers was standing in a doorway, asking permission to cross a threshold. She turned to look at him. He looked different in the firelight, less intimidating, more human. The scar on his face caught the light, and she could see that it was old, years old, and she wondered who had given it to him, and whether they were still alive, and suspected she knew the answer. "Tell me about the river," she said. "Your river. The one that is dying." I was quiet for a moment. Then he came in and sat in the chair by the fire, and he told her. The Ashen Moor River ran through the heart of his territory, 200 miles of cold, clean water that fed the farms and the orchting and the fisheries and the forests that his 7 packs depended on. 3 years ago, a rival pack called the Iron Moor had begun mining copper upstream, dumping the waste into the headwaters. The river had started to change. The water went grey first, then green, then the color of old bruises. The fish died. The farms began to fail. The forest along the banks started to thin and brown. He had tried everything. Diplomacy. Threats. He had gone to war with the Iron Moor twice and won both times, but they had retreated upstream, where the terrain made attack suicidal, and the mining continued, and the river continued to die, and his people continued to starve. He had been coming to Thornmere to negotiate water rights, access to their river, which was still clean, to supplement his dying supply. It was a desperate measure, a stopgap, the kind of solution that buys time but does not solve the problem. And then he had walked past a fish shed and smelled something through the door. Cedar smoke and starlight and the clean mineral scent of a river that has just been healed. And his wolf had lunged forward with a force he had not felt in years, and he had opened the door, and she was there. "Your blood," he said. "This morning. You were bleeding into the river." Elara touched the bandage on her palm. "Yes, 3 miles downstream. The water cleared. The fish came back. In a single morning, a section of dead river came back to life." She sat with this information, the way she had sat with everything today. Carefully. Assessing. trying to find the angle from which it made sense, and finding instead that it made no sense from any angle and that she had to accept it anyway, because the alternative was denial, and she had spent 23 years in various forms of denial, and she was tired of it. "You think I can heal your river?" she said. "I think you already did," he said, without knowing, without trying, just by being near it. He leaned forward in the chair. The firelight caught his eyes, and for a moment they were not amber, but gold, pure and bright, the color of something valuable. "But I need you to understand something," he said. "I did not claim you because of the river. I claimed you because my wolf recognized you. The river is—" He paused, searching for the word. "The river is a gift I did not expect and do not deserve. And if I cannot do it again," she said, "if it was a fluke, if my blood in the water was a coincidence, and I have no power and no wolf, not really, and you brought me to Ashen Moor, and the river keeps dying, would you still want me?" It was a test. She knew it was a test, and he knew it was a test. And they both knew that the answer to the test would determine whether this was real or transactional, whether the bond was a connection or a contract. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said something that broke open the last locked door in her chest. "The river is not why I am sitting in this room. The river is not why my wolf is pacing inside me right now, because I am 6 feet away from you, and it feels like 6 miles. If you never touch the water again, if the Ashen Moor dries to dust, if my territory crumbles and my packs scatter, and I lose everything I have spent my life building, I would still be sitting in this room. Because you are the only thing that has ever made my wolf be still." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire crackled and popped between them, and outside the window, the river ran silver in the moonlight, carrying her blood downstream to places she had never been and would soon see. She slept that night in a real bed for the first time she could remember. The sheets smelled like lavender, and the fire burned low and steady, and the wolf inside her curled against the warmth of the bond like a cat against a hearth, and she dreamed of water. Not cold water, not the grey, dying water of Ashen Moor or the icy current of the Thornmere traps. Warm water, clear water, water that glowed silver from within, and in it she could see fish turning. Hundreds of them, thousands, their scales catching the light like coins at the bottom of a wishing well. She woke at dawn. Habit. 23 years of pre-dawn rising had built a clock inside her that no single night of comfort could override. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling, which was made of old wood beams crossed at angles that suggested the builder had cared about things like proportion and beauty, which was not something she was used to, people caring about things like that in her immediate vicinity. Then she got up and went to the window and looked at the river and froze. The water was silver, not reflecting the moon, which had set, not catching the dawn, which had not yet arrived. The water itself was glowing, a soft, steady silver that lit up the banks and turned the mist above the surface into something that looked like breath. And in the water, she could see them. Fish. Dozens of them. Moving upstream in a current that should have been empty, because Thornmere's river had been declining for weeks, and the spawning run was late, and the traps were empty. Except they were not empty anymore. She pressed her hand against the glass. Her bandaged hand, the one with the wound that had been bleeding into the water all day yesterday. The hand whose blood had traveled downstream and apparently done something impossible. A knock on the door. She opened it. Kael was standing there, dressed for travel, and his eyes were bright and alert, and he smelled like coffee and leather, and the specific ozone smell of a wolf that has been awake all night because he could not sleep, because his mate was in the next room, and 6 feet felt like 6 miles. "The river," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw it from my window." "Did I do that?" He looked at her bandaged hand, at the fading silver in her eyes that she did not know was there, but that he could see as clearly as the scar on his own face. "I think you have been doing it for years," he said. "Every time you bled into the water, every cut, every scrape, every wound. The fish in Thornmere. The traps were never full because you were a good trapper. They were full because you were feeding the river with your blood, and you did not know it." She leaned against the doorframe. The world tilted, not physically, but conceptually. The way it tilts when you realize that the story you have been living in is not the story you thought it was. "They told me I had no wolf," she said. "They tested me every year at the shifting ceremony, and every year nothing happened. And they told me I was broken." "You were not broken," Kael said. "You were dormant. Lunar wolves do not shift the way other wolves do. They do not need a full moon or a ceremony or an audience. They shift when they find their anchor, their purpose, their mate." He reached up and touched her face. Just his fingertips, just the lightest contact along the line of her jaw. The touch sent silver sparks skating across her skin, visible, actual light. And he watched them travel, and she watched him watching. And for a moment, the world contracted to the point where his skin met hers and nothing else existed. Nothing. "Come to Ashen Moor," he said. "Not for the river, not for the fish, for yourself. Because you deserve to know what you are," she nodded. And in the nodding, in that single, small gesture of the head, she felt the fish traps of Thornmere close behind her, like doors she would never need to open again. Leaving was not simple. Leaving is never simple. Even when you are leaving a place that has given you nothing but pain. Because pain becomes familiar, and familiar becomes home and home. Even a bad one, even a brutal one, is hard to release, because releasing it means admitting that you endured it for nothing, that the years you spent adapting to cruelty were years you will not get back. Elara packed her things in less than 5 minutes, because she did not have many things. A change of clothes, her knife, the good one, the one she had sharpened herself. A tin of salve she mixed from river herbs that she used on her cracked hands. A single book, a field guide to freshwater fish species that she had found in the keep's discard pile 3 years ago, and that she had read so many times the spine was held together with gut thread and hope. She walked through the keep one last time, down the corridor where she had eaten 1,000 meals on the floor, past the kitchen where Bridget was already shouting at her morning staff, and through the kitchen door Elara could smell bread baking, and she paused because the smell of bread was the single kindest thing Thornmere had ever given her, and she wanted to take it with her, carry it in her memory, like a stone worn smooth by water. Bridget saw her through the doorway. Their eyes met. Bridget raised one flour-dusted hand. Not quite a wave. Not quite a salute. Something in between. A gesture that said, "I see you going, and I am not surprised, and I hope wherever you end up has better traps." Elara raised her bandaged hand in return. Then she kept walking. She passed through the courtyard, where the Ashenmore Guard was assembling. 12 wolves in traveling formation, their horses stamping and snorting in the morning cold, their breath making white clouds in the air. Sarah was among them, checking straps and adjusting saddles with the competent efficiency of someone who has traveled 1,000 roads and knows exactly what each one requires. Cale was standing by a horse the color of midnight, a massive animal that looked like it had been bred specifically to carry a man his size. I was talking to Alpha Harren, and their conversation had the stiff, formal quality of two people who are saying one thing and meaning another. Elara walked toward them. Every wolf in the courtyard felt her approach. She could see it in the way their heads turned, in the subtle shifting of weight and attention, in the way the air itself seemed to tighten around her, as if the morning had taken a breath and was holding it. Harren turned to look at her. His face was the same as it always was, pleasant, neutral. The face of a man who had mastered the art of giving nothing away. But his eyes tracked the fading silver light in hers, and she saw something that might have been regret or might have been calculation, and with Harren she would never be sure which, and she decided it did not matter. "Elara," Harren said, "I hope you understand that Thornmere has always—" He paused, searching for a word that could retrospectively transform 18 years of indifference into something more palatable. "Valued your contributions. You did not know my name until yesterday," she said. "It was not cruel. It was not angry. It was just true, and the truth landed between them with the weight of a stone dropped into still water." Harren's mouth opened and closed. He looked at Kyle, who was watching this exchange with an expression of absolute neutrality that concealed, Elara knew, a wolf that was vibrating with the effort of not dismantling Harren piece by piece. Then something happened that she had not anticipated. Ronan appeared at the edge of the courtyard. He looked terrible. His face had the grey, hollow look of a man who has not slept, and his hands were shaking, and his eyes were bloodshot in a way that suggested he had spent the night drinking or crying or both. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, and he looked at Elara, and on his face was something she had never seen there before. Not remorse, exactly. Ronan was not built for remorse, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like the dawning, sickening realization that the things you did when no one was watching are now being watched, and the person watching has the power to end you. And the only thing standing between you and annihilation is the mercy of the woman you hurt. He stood there for 10 seconds. His mouth worked. She thought he was going to say something, an apology maybe, or an excuse, or one of those desperate, self-serving explanations that people construct when they are trying to retroactively justify cruelty. But he did not speak. He just stood there, and his hands shook, and then he turned and walked away. And Elara watched him go, and felt nothing. Not vindication, not satisfaction, not even relief. Just a clean, clear emptiness, like the sound after a bell stops ringing. Kale helped her onto a horse. Not his horse, a smaller one, a grey mare with gentle eyes and a temperament that Sarah had selected specifically because she knew her alpha's mate would be riding for the first time. The saddle creaked under her and the horse shifted beneath her weight, and for a moment she felt the familiar vertigo of being somewhere new, of the ground changing beneath her without her consent. Then Kyle mounted his own horse and brought it alongside hers, and their knees almost touched, and the bond hummed between them like a wire in the wind, and the Ashenmore guard formed up around them, and they rode out of Thornmere at a walk, through the gate, down the canyon road, past the river that was still glowing silver in the morning light. Elara did not look back. There are people who look back, and people who do not. And she had spent 23 years looking back, checking over her shoulder for the next blow, the next insult, the next casual cruelty. She was done looking back. The road to Ashen Moor took 3 days. They travelled through forests that changed character as they crossed territory lines. Thornmere's woods were dense pine and spruce, dark and tight, the kind of forest that keeps its secrets by burying them under decades of fallen needles. Ashen Moor's forests were different. Open, ancient oak and ash, the kind of trees that have been growing so long they have developed personalities. The light came through the canopy in long, angled shafts that hit the forest floor like spotlights, and the air smelled like leaf mold and mushrooms and the deep, clean earthiness of soil that has never been poisoned. They camped the first night by a stream. Sarah set the watch rotation and built the fire and produced from her saddlebags a meal of dried venison, hard cheese, and bread that was better than anything Elara had eaten in months. She sat by the fire and ate with both hands and tried not to eat too fast, because eating too fast after prolonged hunger causes cramps, and she knew this from experience. Cale sat beside her, not touching, close enough that the heat of his body reached her through the cooling night air, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like a blanket. "Tell me about Ashen Moor," she said. He told her. About the river, which had once been the cleanest in the territory. About the Iron Moor Pack, which had been mining copper in the headwaters for 3 years, despite 2 wars and a dozen diplomatic missions. About his people, who were loyal and strong and increasingly hungry, because when the river dies, the land dies, and when the land dies, the people follow. He told her about his pack, about Sarah, who had been his commander since he was 20, and who had once dragged him out of a burning building by his ankle because he was too stubborn to leave on his own. About his council, which was old and conservative, and would have opinions about his mate that they would express with precisely calibrated politeness and passive-aggressive seating arrangements. He told her about his wolf, about how it had always been large, always been difficult, always been balanced on the edge of control in a way that frightened the people who were supposed to advise him. About how the wolf had been getting worse over the past 3 years, coinciding with the river's decline, as if the two were connected, as if his wolf's stability was somehow tied to the health of the water that fed his territory, and about how, the moment he had opened the door of the fish shed and smelled her, the wolf had gone still, completely, instantly, terrifyingly still, as if it had found, after years of restless, aggressive searching, the exact thing it had been looking for, and could finally stop. On the second night, the Iron Moor attacked. They came out of the forest at dusk, when the light was dying and the shadows were long and the border between visibility and darkness was exactly the kind of tactical advantage that a well-planned ambush requires. 12 wolves shifted, their fur the dark iron grey that gave the pack its name. Sarah felt them first. She shouted a warning that cut through the camp like a blade, and the Ashen Moor guard was on their feet in seconds, weapons drawn, forming a perimeter around Kyle and Elara, with the practiced fluidity of a unit that has done this many times before. "Stay behind me," Kyle said, and his voice was different now, harder, flatter, the voice of a man who has set aside every soft thing about himself, because softness is a luxury that combat does not permit. Han shifted. Elara had never seen a wolf that size. She had seen wolves shift, of course, Thornmere was a wolf pack. She had stood at the edge of shifting ceremonies and watched bodies contract and expand and reshape themselves into the lupine forms that were their birthright. But those wolves were dogs compared to this. Kael's wolf was massive, black as the space between stars, with eyes that burned amber in the dying light, and a presence that warped the air around it, the way a bonfire warps the air above it. He met the first Iron Moor wolf in the middle of the camp, and the collision was like two trucks meeting head-on. The sound, bone and muscle and teeth, filled the forest and sent birds screaming from the canopy, and Elara pressed herself against a tree and watched with silver eyes that were not afraid, because the wolf inside her was not afraid. The wolf inside her was watching its mate fight, and what it felt was not fear. It was recognition. It was the specific, primal satisfaction of seeing the person you belong to do the thing they were built for. The fight was brutal and fast. Kael was not elegant. He was efficient. He fought the way the river flows, inevitable, powerful, finding the path of least resistance and taking it with absolute commitment. 2 of the Iron Moor wolves went down in the first 30 seconds. A third tried to flank him, and Sarah cut it off, shifting mid-stride, her wolf a lean silver blur that hit the attacker from the side and drove it into the ground. But there were too many. The Ashen Moor guard was outnumbered, and the Iron Moor wolves were desperate, fighting with the cornered, reckless intensity of a pack that has been losing for 3 years and sees this ambush as its last chance to change the equation. One of them broke through the perimeter. It came straight for Elara. A grey wolf with one ear torn and eyes that were wet and bloodshot, and not entirely sane. It charged through the gap in the guard's formation and crossed the 20 feet between the perimeter and the tree where she was standing in about 2 seconds, which was not enough time to run and not enough time to scream, and just barely enough time for the wolf inside her to react. Elara's hands came up. Instinct. Not training. Not strategy. The pure, reflexive response of a body that has been in danger so many times that it has developed its own protocols for survival, independent of conscious thought. Silver light exploded from her palms. Not a beam. Not a blast. A wave. A pulse of silver-white energy that expanded outward from her body like a ripple in water, and it hit the charging wolf, and the wolf stopped. Not dead. Not wounded. Stopped. Frozen in mid-air, suspended in the silver light, its legs still extended in the running position, its mouth still open, its eyes still wild, but now also confused, the way any creature is confused when the laws of physics suddenly stop applying. The entire battle froze. Not because Elara had stopped it, though the pulse of silver light had knocked every combatant off balance, but because every wolf on both sides, Ashen Moor and Iron Moor, had felt what she had done, had felt the power roll through them like a tremor in the earth, had turned their heads toward the woman standing against the tree with light pouring from her hands, and understood, in the immediate, wordless way that wolves understand, that something had just changed. The Iron Moor wolf hovering in front of her whimpered. It was not a sound of pain. It was a sound of submission, pure and total. The sound a wolf makes when it encounters something so far above it. In the hierarchy of power, that resistance becomes not just futile, but inconceivable. Elara did not know what she was doing. She did not know how she was doing it. She only knew that the light was coming from the same place the wolf lived, and the wolf was awake and angry and protective, and pouring its power through her hands, like water through an opened dam, and the iron-moor wolf was hanging in the air in front of her, like a puppet with its strings cut, and the entire forest was silent, except for the sound of the river, which she could hear even though it was miles away, could hear it running through the earth beneath her feet, and she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that she had always been able to hear it. Always. The river. Every river. The water running beneath the surface of the world, like blood running beneath the surface of skin. She released the iron-moor wolf. It fell to the ground, scrambled upright, and ran. The others followed, all of them. 12 iron-grey wolves, disappearing into the forest with the speed and silence of animals who have just encountered a predator. They did not know existed and want nothing more than to be somewhere, anywhere else. Cale shifted back. He was breathing hard, scratched and bleeding from half a dozen shallow wounds, and his eyes were locked on Elara with an expression that combined amazement and hunger and pride and fear in proportions that should not have been possible, but were. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She looked down at her hands. The silver light was fading. Her fingers were trembling. "I do not know what I just did." He crossed the camp. His wolf was still visible in his movements, the way he walked, the angle of his head, the directness of his approach. He stopped in front of her and took her hands, the trembling ones, the ones that had just held a wolf in mid-air with light that came from the moon. "You saved us," he said, and she realized, standing in a forest that smelled like blood and pine needles and the ozone aftermath of power, with her mate's hands around hers and his pack staring at her from the tree line, that for the first time in her life, she was not the person being saved. She was the one doing the saving, and it felt like standing up after a lifetime of kneeling. They reached Ashen Moor on the 3rd evening. The territory announced itself the way territories do. A change in the air, a shift in the quality of the light, a border that was invisible but unmistakable, like the line between sleep and waking. The river was the first thing she saw. It wound through a valley of ancient oaks, wider and slower than the Thornmere River, and she could see the damage even from a distance. The water was grey. Not the clean grey of stone or sky, but the sick grey of something dying, like the film that forms over an eye when the light behind it starts to go out. The banks were bare. The trees nearest the water were brown. The air smelled like copper, and something worse, like the breath of a furnace that has been burning the wrong thing. Cale watched her face as she took it in. He did not try to soften it, or explain it, or prepare her for it. He just let her see. "This is what I am asking you to save," he said. "And if you cannot, I will still be glad you are here." She dismounted, walked to the bank. The grass under her feet was brittle and yellow, and it crunched like old paper. She crouched at the water's edge and dipped her fingers in. The water was warm. Not the good warmth of sun-heated shallows, but the fever warmth of infection, of chemistry gone wrong. She could feel the copper in it, taste it in the back of her throat, even though she had not put her mouth near it. And beneath the copper, beneath the sick warmth, she could feel something else. The river was still alive, barely, distantly, like a heartbeat so faint you have to hold your breath to hear it. But it was there, and her wolf felt it, and responded with a sound that was not a howl, but was cousin to one, a low, vibrating note that traveled down her arm and through her fingertips and into the water. And the water stirred. Not much, a ripple, a slight change in the current near her hand, a circular movement that had not been there before. As if the river had felt her touch and turned toward it, the way a sleeping person turns toward warmth. She looked at her palm. The wound from the trap hinge was still there, stitched but not healed, and she knew, with the wordless, absolute certainty of instinct, what she needed to do. She pulled the stitches out. Cale made a sound behind her. She heard him step forward, heard Sarah catch his arm, heard the low murmur of the commander saying, "Wait, let her." And she was grateful because she needed to do this without interruption, without comfort, without anyone telling her to stop. The blood came, slow at first, then faster, dripping from her palm into the grey water. The silver light returned. This time it was not a flash or a pulse. It was a tide. It rolled out from where her blood hit the water and spread downstream, a wave of silver-white luminescence that transformed the river as it travelled. The grey water turned clear. The warmth faded, replaced by the clean cold of a healthy current. And the light kept going, spreading, rolling downstream like a dawn that had been delayed for 3 years and was making up for lost time. She could feel it in her bones. The river flowing through her, or she flowing through the river. The distinction had ceased to matter. She was the source, and the source was her, and the blood falling from her palm was not a sacrifice but a conversation, a dialogue between her body and the water that had been trying to reach her for her entire life. Fish appeared. She saw them in the silver light, rising from the depths where they had been hiding. Hundreds of them, trout and salmon and species she did not recognize, drawn to the light, the way all living things are drawn to the thing that sustains them. They circled her hand in the water, their bodies brushing her fingers, their scales catching the silver light and scattering it like broken glass. Behind her, she heard Kael's wolves. She heard them shifting, not to fight, but to witness. Dropping to 4 legs, because 4 legs brought them closer to the earth, and the earth was telling them something they needed to hear. She heard them howling, one voice at first, and then another and another, a chorus that rose into the night sky, and bounced off the canyon walls and came back as something larger, something that was not just sound, but meaning, and the meaning was, she is here, she is ours, she has come. She bled until she could not bleed anymore, until the silver light stabilized, and the river ran clear as far as she could see, and her vision went grey at the edges, and her body tipped forward, and she was falling towards the water that she had just healed. And then Kael's arms were around her, pulling her back, lifting her off the bank as if she weighed nothing. And she was pressed against his chest, and his heartbeat was in her ear. And it was fast, fast, the heartbeat of a man who is terrified and awed and in love, and cannot tell the difference between any of those things. "You need to stop," he said against her hair. "Elara, you need to stop. The river can wait. You cannot bleed yourself dry." She looked up at him. Her vision was tunneling. The silver light in her eyes was fading, replaced by the ordinary darkness of exhaustion. But she could still see his face, the scar, the jaw, the eyes that were amber going dark with fear. "Is it working?" she whispered. "It is working," he said. "It is working. The river is clearing for miles. The scouts are reporting fish returns. It is working. Now stop. Please." The please broke something in her. or mended something. She was not sure which. She had never been asked to stop. She had always been asked to do more, work harder, endure longer, suffer quieter. No one had ever looked at her, giving everything, and said, "You have given enough." She closed her eyes. The darkness was warm, and it smelled like cedar smoke, and it tasted like the river, and it sounded like his heartbeat. Steady now. Steady. The heartbeat of a wolf that has found its anchor and does not intend to let go. She woke in a bed that was not the guest quarters in Thornmere. This bed was larger, softer, in a room with stone walls and high windows and a fireplace big enough to stand in. The sheets smelled like Pat and something else, something warm and male, and she realized she was in his room, his bed, his space. I was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the river. He had not slept. She could tell by the quality of the light in his eyes, dim and steady, the light of a flame that has been burning all night. "How long?" she said. 14 hours, he said without turning. He said it the way a man says a number that has been occupying his mind for the entire duration of that number. A man who has counted every hour the way she once counted drips from a gutter pipe. She sat up. Her palm was bandaged again, properly this time, and her side no longer hurt, and her body felt strange, not weak, not strong, different, rearranged, as if the act of healing the river had rearranged something inside her as well, shifted the furniture in a room she had always lived in, but never fully occupied. "The river," she said. He turned then, and she saw his face in the morning light, and it was different from every other face she had seen in her life because it was looking at her with something she had no practice receiving. Not gratitude, not desire, not the blank indifference she was accustomed to. Something bigger. Something that contained all of those things, but was more than any of them. "The river is running clear for 20 miles downstream," he said. "The fish populations have tripled overnight. My scouts report the water table is rising in the east fields." He paused. "3 of my pack elders are waiting outside this room right now. They have been there since dawn. They want to formally ask your forgiveness for doubting my choice of mate." Elara looked at the door, then at the window, then at Kyle. "Tell them to come back after breakfast," she said. "I am starving," he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and the sound was unaffected, deep and genuine, and with a crack in it that suggested it was not something he did often, that laughter was a muscle he had not used in a while, and it was stiff. Breakfast came. Real breakfast. Eggs and bread and smoked salmon, actual salmon from the Ashenmoor River, caught that morning by fishermen who had gone out in the dark because they had heard the river was running clear and did not believe it until they saw the fish jumping in the silver water. There was butter and honey and a pot of tea that smelled like chamomile, and something she did not recognize, but that she would later learn was a flower that grew only along the banks of healthy rivers and that had not been seen in Ashenmoor for 3 years. She ate slowly, not because she was being polite, but because her body had forgotten what abundance felt like and needed time to remember. Cale watched her eat. He drank his coffee, which was black and strong, and smelled like the coffee itself was intimidated by him, and he watched her eat with an expression of quiet, absolute satisfaction, the way a man watches a fire he has been trying to start for hours finally catch. After breakfast, the elders came. 3 of them, old wolves with silver hair and careful eyes, and the particular posture of people who have been wrong about something important and are trying to handle it with dignity. They stood before her and spoke formally, acknowledging the mate bond, acknowledging her power, acknowledging that they had been prepared to counsel Kael against claiming a wolfless Omega, and were now, in light of recent developments, revising that position. Elara listened. She accepted their words with a gravity that surprised them, because they had expected either anger or tears, and she gave them neither. She gave them the calm, measured attention of a woman who has spent 23 years listening to people who did not think she mattered, and has gotten very good at hearing what they actually mean beneath what they actually say. When they left, Kael looked at her. "You handled that well," he said. "I have had practice," she said, being underestimated. He set down his coffee, crossed the room, stood in front of her, close enough that she could feel his heat, close enough that the bond sang between them like a wire in the wind. "The marking ceremony," he said, "the formal claim. It happens at the full moon, 3 days from now, if you agree." She looked up at him. He was enormous from this angle, blocking the light from the window, the way he had blocked the light in the fish shed doorway. And she remembered that moment, that first moment, the way the world had rearranged itself when he inhaled. "What happens during the marking," she said. He told her. The bite, the neck, the bond made permanent, irreversible, etched into the blood and bone of both wolves, so deeply that separation after marking was said to be worse than death, because death was absence and separation, after marking was presence without proximity, an awareness of the other person at all times without the ability to reach them. "It sounds permanent," she said. "It is," he said. "And if it goes wrong, if I go wrong, if the power fades, or the wolf sleeps again, or—" He put his hand on the side of her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, the same way his thumb had traced the wound on her palm that first day, following the contour, learning the geography. "Nothing about you will go wrong," he said. "You are the steadiest person I have ever met. You stood in freezing water every day for years and never broke. You endured a pack that treated you like furniture and came out of it with your compassion intact. You bled into a dying river and brought it back to life. You are not going wrong. You went right a long time ago. The rest of the world is just catching up." She leaned into his hand, closed her eyes, felt the warmth of his palm against her cheek, and the steady pulse of the bond between them and the wolf inside her, awake and present and no longer waiting, no longer dormant, no longer hidden. 3 days, she said. I will be ready. The full moon rose over Ashenmoor like an eye-opening. The ceremony was held on the bank of the river. Not in a great hall, not in a throne room, not in any of the formal spaces where such things were traditionally conducted. Kael had chosen the river, and when his council protested the break in tradition, he had looked at them with the expression that Elara had learned meant the discussion is over. And the discussion was over. The pack gathered, all of them. 7 packs, hundreds of wolves, standing on the banks in human form, and wolf form, and every stage in between, their eyes catching the moonlight and throwing it back in amber and green and gold. The air smelled like penna and river water, and the clean mineral scent of healthy current, because the river was running clear now, clear and strong, the silver healing traveling farther downstream every day, pushing the copper and the poison back toward its source. Elara stood on the bank in a dress she had not chosen. Sarah had chosen it, a simple white dress of the kind that looks unremarkable until you realize it has been cut by someone who understands the architecture of fabric, and in the moonlight the white turned silver, and she looked like something that had been poured from the moon itself. She was terrified, not of the ceremony, not of the bite, not of the permanence. She was terrified of deserving it, of standing on this bank in front of hundreds of wolves who had decided she was worth something, and wondering when they would change their minds. Because people had been changing their minds about her for 23 years, and the scar tissue of that did not dissolve in 3 days, not even 3 days with him. Cale stepped forward. He was in human form, dressed in black, and the scar on his face was silver in the moonlight, and his eyes were amber going gold, and he was looking at her the way the river looks at the moon, as if she were the force that moved him. He took her hands. "In front of my packs," he said, and his voice carried across the water, and the banks and the trees and the wolves, standing in them. "I claim this woman as my mate. Not because she is powerful, not because she can heal the river, not because her wolf is the rarest in a generation. I claim her because she is the only person who has ever made the noise stop." He paused. "And because she was willing to finish gutting the fish before she let me change her life." A sound went through the crowd. Not laughter exactly. Something warmer. Recognition. The sound of people hearing something true and acknowledging it. He leaned down, his mouth near her neck. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and steady, and the wolf inside her rose to meet it, pressing against the inside of her body, like a tide pressing against a shore. The bite. It was not what she expected. She had imagined pain, because her life had trained her to imagine pain as the default outcome of any significant moment. But the bite was not painful. It was clarifying. Like a lens clicking into focus, like a frequency resolving from static into signal. She felt his teeth break the skin, felt the blood well up, felt the bond between them deepen and solidify, and become something structural, something load-bearing, something that could hold the weight of 2 lives and not bend. She gasped, not from pain, from completion, from the sensation of something that had been waiting to happen, finally happening. And the relief of it was so profound that it brought tears, the first tears she had shed in years, and they ran down her face and fell into the river. And the river caught them and carried them downstream, and wherever they touched, the water glowed silver, faintly, briefly like a river full of stars. Cale pulled back, blood on his lips. Her blood. And in his eyes, something she had never seen in anyone's eyes before, directed at her. Something that went beyond love, beyond desire, beyond the bond. Something that looked like home. She bit him back. He had not told her to. He had not expected it. But her wolf knew what it wanted, and she had learned to trust her wolf, and she put her mouth against the muscle of his neck, where it met his shoulder, and she bit hard, and his blood tasted like copper and pine, and the very first river, the one that runs beneath all the others, the one that connects everything. And he made a sound that was not human and not wolf, but something older than both. The crowd howled, every wolf, 7 packs. The sound filled the valley and bounced off the mountains and rose into the sky. And somewhere in that howl was the sound of a river coming back to life, and a woman coming into her power, and a man who had spent his life being feared, finally being understood. The Iron Maw came 3 weeks later. They did not come to fight. They came because the river was running clear into their territory now. The healing spreading upstream, like a current running backward, defying the laws of hydrology and chemistry and everything. The pack's mining engineers had told them was irreversible. The copper was dissolving. The waste was neutralizing. The fish were returning to waters that had been dead for years. They came with their alpha, a man named Gideon, who was smaller than Kael, but carried himself with the rigid, exhausted posture of someone who has been holding something together for too long and knows it is slipping. He stood in the great hall of Ashenmoor, surrounded by Kael's guard, and he looked at Alara with eyes that were red-rimmed and hollow and desperate. "We heard about the lunar wolf," Gideon said. His voice was hoarse. "We heard what she did to the river." Kael stood beside Alara. His hand was on the small of her back, a gesture that was simultaneously possessive and protective and tender, and she leaned into it because she had learned, in 3 weeks of being touched by someone who meant it, that touch did not have to be a prelude to pain. "My mate healed the river that your pack poisoned," Kael said. Gideon flinched. The word poisoned landed in him like a blade, and she could see the wound of it, the specific, personal shame of a man who had allowed something terrible to happen under his authority, because the alternative was admitting that his pack's economy depended on destruction. "We needed the copper," Gideon said. "Our territory is poor. The mines were the only—" He stopped, swallowed, and then said something that Alara, who had spent a lifetime being mistreated by people in power, did not expect. "I am not here to justify it," he said. "I know what we did. I knew what we were doing while we were doing it. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself the river would recover. I was wrong on both counts, and I am not here to pretend otherwise." The great hall was silent. Kael's wolves watched, Sarah watched, the elders watched, and Alara watched, and in Gideon's eyes she saw something she recognized from the inside, the look of someone who has been surviving for so long that they have forgotten there was ever another option. "What do you want?" Kael said. Gideon looked at him, then at Alara. "Help," he said, and the word cost him everything. Kael looked at Alara, not for permission, not for advice. He looked at her because looking at her was how he made decisions now, because the steady silver light in her eyes was the only compass he trusted. She stepped forward. "I will heal your section of the river," she said, and Gideon's face crumpled with relief. "But," she continued, and the relief froze, "the mining stops. Today. Permanently. Your pack finds another way to sustain itself, or you come to Ashenmoor, and we find one together. But the river is not a thing to be used until it breaks. It is alive. And it has been alive longer than any of us, and it will be alive long after we are gone. But only if we let it." She said this with the calm authority of someone who has discovered that the thing she was always told made her weak. Her connection to the water, her sensitivity, her inability to be hard, was actually the source of her power. And the entire room felt it. Not just the words, the truth behind them. The lunar wolf's truth, which was older than pack law and hierarchy and territory, and which said, simply and without negotiation, the water comes first. Gideon agreed. He agreed because he had no choice, and because, beneath the desperation and the shame, he was not a monster. He was a man who had made terrible decisions for understandable reasons, and now that someone was offering him a way out that did not require him to lose everything, he took it with both hands and held on. The Ironmoor pack joined Ashenmoor, not as a conquered territory, but as a partner, which was Alara's idea, and which Kael's council initially resisted until Kael reminded them, with a glance that carried the weight of a continent, that his mate's ideas had a track record of working. Elara healed the river. All of it. 200 miles. She did it over 6 months, walking the banks, wading into the shallows, bleeding into the current, at the places where the damage was worst, and the silver light spread downstream and upstream, and into the tributaries and the aquifers, and the land came back to life around the water, the way color comes back to a photograph that has been fading in sunlight. It cost her. Healing always costs something. She was tired in a way that sleep did not fix, tired in her bones, tired in the marrow. But the tiredness was different from the exhaustion of Thornmere. That exhaustion had been the exhaustion of futility, of effort without purpose. This tiredness had meaning. This tiredness had consequence. When she closed her eyes at night, she could hear the fish in the river, hundreds of thousands of them now, turning in the current. And the sound of them was the sound of everything she had ever done mattering. The fish, the traps, the years of standing in cold water, the cracked hands, the knife she kept sharp, the gut thread she used to stitch her own wounds. None of it had been wasted. All of it had been preparation. All of it been the slow, patient education of a woman who was born to understand water and had to learn it the hardest way possible, because no one told her what she was. On the night the last section of river cleared, Elara stood on the bank at the place where the headwaters emerged from the mountains, and the water that flowed past her feet was cold and clean and silver with moonlight. Kyle stood behind her, his chest against her back, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on the top of her head. His wolf was quiet. Her wolf was quiet. The river was loud, running over rocks and around bends and through the territory that would sustain 7 packs and an alliance that had not existed 6 months ago, and a future that neither of them could see, but both of them could feel. The way you feel the current of a river, even when you cannot see the water. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The river said it for them, running clear and cold and alive through the land they would spend the rest of their lives protecting, carrying with it the faintest trace of silver. A light that had been dormant for 23 years and was now, finally, everywhere. She leaned back against him. He tightened his arms. The moon was full above them, and the fish were jumping in the current, and somewhere downstream, in the pools where the river ran deepest, the trout were spawning, filling the water with eggs that would hatch in the spring into fingerlings that would grow into fish that would swim upstream past the place where a woman once bled into the water and changed everything. A single trout broke the surface 10 feet from where they stood. It hung in the air for a moment, silver scales catching the moonlight, and then it fell back into the current with a sound like a small door closing. The ripples spread outward, intersecting with the current, dissolving into the river's larger movement. Elara watched the ripples disappear. She pressed her palm, the one with the scar, flat against the back of Kael's hand, where it rested on her stomach. She could feel his pulse through his skin. It matched hers. It had matched hers since the fish shed. It would match hers as for the rest of their lives. 2 heartbeats, synchronized to the rhythm of a river that would never die again. The last ripple faded. The river ran on,